All right. So first up, I think we should start with a duo of stories that relate to each other. Microsoft announced it's buying Activision Blizzard for $68 billion of cash. Microsoft's got a lot of cash. And I think we all understand why this is a great idea for Microsoft with Xbox. And obviously, Activision owns Call of Duty, which has 120 million or so monthly active users. They also own a bunch of nerd stuff from Blizzard, like Diablo, World of Warcraft, my favorite, StarCraft. And those have upwards of 40 million. They also had bought King, if you remember that. They make Candy Crush and those kind of casual games, which have 250 million users. But even with all of these, it's a highly fragmented market. But in related news, Lina Khan, the, I believe, 32-year-old head of the FTC, who has written a bunch of pieces. We talked about this on All In episode 36. Sat down with Kara Swisher and Andrew Ross Sorkin for an interview. And basically, we're moving, or she intends to move the goalposts on antitrust. I want to play 3 clips and have you each react to them. Here's the first one. And this is her take on changing the antitrust from consumer harm to now shift to, does this deal, and we'll take the Activision deal here as but one example, but you could take the Instagram and the YouTube deals as well. Do these deals substantially reduce competition in the future? Let's watch the first clip.
In certain cases, maybe too much success. And so the question is, when is the regulator supposed to say, this could work, and if it works, it's actually worked too well?
It's an interesting question. And I think, for enforcers, the real question is this a deal that could lessen competition? And in hindsight,
all deals to some degree, are going to lessen competition.
Substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. And there's also indication that Congress wanted enforcers not just to act when, the third and fourth companies are merging or the first and second, but actually in the incipiency. When you see trends towards concentration, that those can also be important moments for enforcers to jump in.
So what do we think, Friedberg, about this sort of new rubric? Not consumer harm, because obviously if Microsoft buys Activision and makes those part of Game Pass and you get Call of Duty for free with your Game Pass and the Candy Crush games and Blizzard games, that's good for consumers. They get a whole bunch of more games. It would be like Disney buying Star Wars. You get all the Star Wars stuff in Disney Plus for the same low price.
Yeah. Look, Sacks is our legal eagle here.
Legal eagle.
But I'll just say before, he probably speaks better informed than me. If it's not about consumer harm and it's about decreasing competition in this broadly, I would argue, subjective sense, then what's scary is that there are going to be decisions made by interpreters of what is and isn't competitive. And ultimately, if they're not trying to keep in mind the best interest of the consumer, then it is, in fact, going to cause consumer harm at some point. Not necessarily in all deals that they block, but there will be deals that they may block that may have benefited consumers, meaning prices go down. Imagine having all of your products integrated in one streaming service instead of having to pay for 3 streaming services. So instead of paying $70 across HBO Max and Disney Plus and Netflix, you get everything in one. But today, the regulators would not let those businesses merge because that would be anti-competitive under this context. And so this is going to be a touchy debate, and it's going to be difficult, I think, ultimately to rationalize this if there is going to be a point in the future where we can actually show that consumer harm would be caused by decreasing competition in a marketplace. And so I would be nervous about that subjectivity and the slippery slope it enables.
I think it's a great point. Think about it. If you had to pay, instead of for Disney Plus, you paid for Pixar Plus, Disney Plus, Marvel Plus, and Star Wars Plus, it'd be chaos in your household to manage all those accounts. It's a much better offering.
Better consumer experience, yeah.
Much better consumer experience and cheaper.
And this is why, by the way, this is why I said in the past, we use the term monopoly as if it's de facto evil and bad. But not all monopolies or businesses that have very big moats, is another way to kind of describe them, are necessarily bad for the customer. You get cheaper products, you get better products, you get more of an advantage. They may ultimately be yielded to be anti-competitive in a harmful way, but not necessarily always.
But let me explain to you where she's coming from. Like, there's a fundamental pillar of capitalism that says that excess returns must get competed away. So if a capitalist system is to be efficient, if a company has profit margins of 99%, competitors emerge, pushing those profit margins down to something reasonable where you get to some sort of equilibrium. And the whole principle of what she's saying is, in the absence of competition, we don't really know what the equilibrium return really looks like. And she's not saying that, but that is the implicitness of what she's saying. And so if you allow all of this stuff to aggregate, maybe Google shouldn't have 45% EBITDA margins. Maybe in a really competitive society, they would only have 18%. And that's actually better net for the system. The problem is that counterfactual, to your point, Friedberg, is impossible to measure. How do you know? And how much value do you need to take away of the panoply of things that Google does to figure that out? And that's, I think, where the problem with it. But, let's be clear. In 2019, I wrote in my annual letter, there's a section called the tightening of the regulatory noose, and meaning it was a framework for how to basically dismantle big tech. And element number one of that was a changing regulatory landscape. And it's really incredible to see it in front of our eyes. We got a bill that just left judiciary, right? That was effectively voted across the aisle. That's now going to go to the floor of the Senate, which is going to rewrite some of these anti-competitive
bills. It was like 75-25, and it was a 50-50 committee of Democrats and Republicans. So clearly across the aisle. And I mean, the funny thing about that was Feinstein and Padilla, the two Democratic senators from California, where most of these companies are, in the Wall Street Journal article that I read, railed against it, but still voted for it to go to the floor. So I think some version of that is going to pass. She's going to go and scrutinize these companies. I still think this Microsoft Activision deal on balance gets done, because if you take the absolute values away from it, the reality is that it's an adjacent part of Microsoft's core business, and there's nothing fundamentally monopolistic about what would happen if you let Microsoft and Activision come together. Could it reduce competition in the future, I think would be her new lens. And if Xbox has Call of Duty and Sony PlayStation doesn't, or the next console doesn't, maybe it does. You could make the argument. Sacks, what are your takes on this? Very hard to apply standard of reducing future competition, because as Aaron Ross Sorkin said very clearly, all of these reduce competition. It's now we got to get into what does the word substantially mean in this context.
Yeah, so my take on Lina Khan is that she's got some worthwhile observations on the problems posed by these big tech monopolies, but I don't think she's got the right remedies. So on the observations, I think she's correct, broadly speaking, that these big tech companies, the FANGs, they have way too much power in the marketplace. They are now gatekeepers over the internet. They control all these powerful platforms. And broadly speaking, it is time, I think, to basically have some limits on those powers, make sure they don't abuse it. I think she's also right that the traditional standard of consumer harm doesn't really capture that sort of concept of market power for these free ad-based services, right? Because there is no pricing. And furthermore, I think she's got a point when she says that,
when you say no pricing, you mean Facebook and Google.
The consumer doesn't pay. So how can there be consumer harm, right? So clearly that there's that standard of consumer harm doesn't really capture the market power dynamic. And then I think the last observation she makes, which I think is pretty valid, is this idea that, when Facebook bought Instagram at that time, it didn't seem to be a problem, but it definitely allowed them to extend their monopoly from the desktop into mobile, and it probably should be scrutinized harder. My problem is with her remedies. I mean, what she's basically saying is, first of all, like you said, any deal that could decrease competition in the future is a problem. Well, the whole goal of business and making business moves like an acquisition is to build your moat, is to win, create a more competitive offering. So there's no limiting factor. There's no bright line test there. At least with consumer harm, there's a bright line test, which is about pricing, right? It's mathematically measurable. So you could create a model around it. Here, there's absolutely nothing. And so what it's going to do is completely politicize the process of getting an M&A deal approved. And you can see this when she's talking about the impact on labor. I mean, this is a total sop to the... Let's go to that This clip. Is a total sop to the labor constituency in the Democratic Party because, look, Facebook and Google, no matter how powerful monopolies they may be, they don't have a dominant position in the labor market. It's just not true. They're competing for the same engineers that every tech company is competing for. So she's bringing a purely political consideration in now. And so, again, there's no bright line rule. It's going to be heavily political. Companies trying to get a merger approval never know whether they're good or not. And even after they get approved, they'll never know they're good. And I have a big problem with her saying that any deal that they approve can be reopened and reevaluated a decade into the future and reversed.
I.e. the actions they're taking against
companies
Instagram
need certainty.
That's the real issue. It's the rules of capitalism have been that the smarter / more strategic, entity, if they can run their plays more efficiently, has the right to win. This is almost trying to say, actually, not really. And that is very problematic.
Yeah,
so
you
never know you're good. You never know you're good.
And then the problem that it'll create in the equity market specifically is
chaos.
How do you actually drive shareholder returns? And then what do all these shareholders then do if these companies are rendered to basically stay where they are?
So
and you take a snapshot. You take a snapshot of the economy and you say, this was what it will be from now on.
But Sacks's point is really interesting. It's going to require M&A to become kind of a political maneuvering process, similar, create sort of these, obfuscated gates where you don't really know what it's going to take to get through there. And then you've got to go do what you do when you try and convince foreign governments to work with you or allow you to do a transaction in a foreign government, in a foreign country, where you got to go in and you got to go figure out the politicians, who they are, what they want, and then put together a political consortium that's going to approve the deal, given that there's now going to be subjective validation, whereas before, I think the criteria were much more objective.
Let me play this other clip. This is the clip that Sacks was referencing. Lina Khan also talks about how labor unions are trying to get in on the action / grift. See you on the other side.
Some of this research has showed that labor markets are significantly concentrated, and it's led to additional thinking at the policy level of how this should be affecting what antitrust enforcers are doing. Mm-hmm. So the Justice Department, including in the last administration, started looking at no poach agreements more closely, instances in which employers may be colluding to suppress wages. Both agencies have been looking at the ways in which mergers in particular may lessen competition for labor and have downstream effects on workers in ways that are harmful, and that also needs to be on our radar. So I think this is an ongoing conversation, but increasingly the question is, how we implement some of these priorities and not, whether they're important.
But this is the first time you've included labor. This is something labor's wanted for a long time, the idea of looking at antitrust through the lens of unemployment, essentially.
Yeah, there's an interesting history here. I mean, there were cases in which, unions were supportive of transactions because they thought they would lead to more downstream benefits. But I think we started to see through retrospective studies instances in which, mergers actually ended up having a harmful effect. And so I think that is what's significantly contributing to this.
This is also part of what I said in 2019. The third element of that plan was you have to change the rules on stock-based compensation. So instead of her talking about it as labor, I think the more accurate way to say it is like there's very valuable human capital in technology business. A few people have, discontinuous impact on these businesses. And it has been a stated strategy of all of big tech to use their balance sheets to buy small companies in their incipiency, to use her words, not because it helps advantage their monopoly, but it prevents the leakage of human capital into other ideas, and it prevents those other ideas from really flourishing. That's really what's been happening for years in Silicon Valley. And we all know that. All the acqui-hiring we see is about hoarding talent. And you'd rather pay these people millions of dollars a year, if you're big tech, to basically work on next to nothing than take the risk of them going across the street to a competitor and then having them build something that disrupts you.
Yeah, and this is such a known
thing. The only way...
Sorry,
just to finish, one of the ways that you can change it is you have to change the way that stock-based compensation works, how it's accounted for, how you can actually deal with it on a GAAP basis, how capitalists then treat that in terms of their earnings. If you don't do that, none of the models change. Yeah. People look past it. People look through it. They don't think it's a real cost, which it is. And then you're allowed to continue to do it. That's really the underlying issue.
And so much so, Chamath, that the hoarding of human capital was a recurring theme on the Silicon Valley HBO show, where people in Hulu were getting paid millions of dollars and hanging out on the roof. Friedberg, when you look at this human capital and labor being brought into it, isn't the point of a lot of M&A to eliminate jobs and eliminate redundancy? So if you brought in YouTube at Google, I'm not sure if you were there at that time period, the distinct concept was, hey, we already have an advanced ad network, we already have accounting, and we already have servers around the world and storage. You don't need to hire those people. We can get rid of them or whatever, and we get rid of that redundancy. Scale.
Large-scale consolidation, that's certainly true. Most M&A in technology is the opposite, where an acquisition takes place and the acquisition gets fueled by further investment after the acquisition is made. When YouTube was acquired, there was a few dozen employees there. And then very quickly, Google scaled that team, the engineering team, the infrastructure team. They even had their own independent ad sales team to thousands of employees. And without that, it would have been very difficult for YouTube to achieve that scale, both from a product success perspective, an infrastructure perspective, but also an employee-based perspective with the amount of capital it would have taken to go and raise that from venture capitalists.
Got it.
Maybe nowadays where there's billions of dollars floating around, it would be different. But back then, it would have been very hard. And
I think
so
that's the same for WhatsApp and Instagram at Facebook.
Yes, exactly. WhatsApp was 19 people when it was acquired, and now it's thousands, I'm certain, and Instagram's the same. And so what we've seen traditionally, or not traditionally, but over the last 10, 15 years with internet-based acquisitions is not about consolidation and reduction in costs, but about taking and enabling technology and accelerating it on an existing platform. Now, number one, it makes that new technology or product far more successful, far more far-reaching, and more consumers benefit from it. Number two is it now makes that platform harder to compete with. So as a platform, it's going to be a lot harder to catch up with the cash flows being generated at Google and at Facebook, given how quickly they reinvest that capital in new technology to further their advancement.
And to your point.
Yeah, but I would say what's been so significant over the past 15 years that people are lifting their head up is that it has been both beneficial to consumers and anti-competitive.
So that was exactly what I was going to get to here. Your YouTube example is the perfect one because if you look at YouTube, think about all the joy, education, communication it has created on a global basis as a juggernaut.
And it's free. Yeah.
And it's free. That has helped humanity so much in this new lens.
But no one else can make a video ad site like
there's
yeah,
exactly.
There's no competition.
We're now looking at all the benefit that YouTube has created for humanity versus the fact that it's going to be impossible to displace YouTube now. To your point, Sacks, how do you get past the bright line? Do you have a suggestion for a way? And would you now look at something like YouTube and say we shouldn't have allowed that to happen? YouTube was on death's door because of the lawsuits and the server bills. We all know that.
Right. Well, this is the uncertainty that's going to be created. And I think this administration is creating tremendous business uncertainty. I think the reaction of a lot of big tech companies is going to be to stop doing M&A until the situation gets clarified because they just don't know. Target companies are going to want to have huge breakup fees. And it's just going to have a chilling effect on the market for M&A. I mean, business needs certainty, and they're not giving it in this business environment. Chamath, before we get to you, just can I make one point about that last clip on the labor point? Listen, this feels to me just like when the administration talked about clean tech and clean energy and electric vehicles, but then they only gave the subsidy to the car companies that were basically union shops, and
they didn't give Tesla the same.
That's right. They excluded Tesla. They excluded Tesla from the EV summit. They tried to pretend that Ford and GM were the ones driving the EV revolution in the U.S. It was laughable. What they were trying to do there is they were shoehorning a union agenda into clean tech, and I think that's what Lina Khan was doing in that clip. She was shoehorning a union agenda into antitrust law, and it's a bit absurd because Facebook and Google, even though they are very powerful companies, when it comes to talent, they are in a war for talent, just like everybody else. They compete against each other. There's not a union
issue there. These are not factory
employees. These are not mistreated employees. These are very well-paid employees. And moreover, the market is highly competitive. And we don't need them trying to insert this union agenda into antitrust law.
You got to think that, for example, going back to Microsoft Activision, obviously the bankers would have called Apple and Facebook and Google as well. I mean, it's absurd that they wouldn't have.
Yeah, they reviewed the packet.
The minute that you think you have a bona fide offer, one of the things you have to do is essentially, get an opinion letter, and also to make sure that as a public market shareholder, you can justify that you've evaluated all the other options, right?
Sure.
But it's really quite telling, to David's point. I don't think that if you were Facebook or Google or Apple, you could have credibly made an offer because the calculus in the back of your head was not whether it had business logic, but whether you could actually get it through the FTC.
But Microsoft did, because Microsoft is no longer seen as a threat.
And look, we said this in our awards show 2 or 3 episodes ago. They have really been the most untouched in the last decade by antitrust scrutiny, whether it domestically or internationally. They've largely skated under the radar after paying the price for an entire decade.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Microsoft's effectively pivoted, with the exception of this gaming, into being an enterprise software company. And The politicians just care a lot less about enterprise software. It doesn't capture the public's imagination. It's the big consumer, companies that get all of that attention.
Fascinating point. Like literally the consumer and the bread and circuses of this is what's driving it. Like people hate big tech and Trump got banned from it, yada, yada.
But I got to say, these increasing restrictions on big tech and these prohibitions and the chilling effect, the uncertainty, it's one thing to do it when the market is just completely ripping and we can sort of afford to run these experiments and tinker with these rules. But I got to